Miss Pitt. Miss Pitt. Miss Pitt. Miss Pitt. Miss Pitt. Oh, she's got some split arms. Spit, spit, spit. Spit, spit, spit. Spit, spit, spit. Spit, spit, spit. With their spit, with their spits. We spit, spit, spit. Spit, spit, spit. With their spits, with their spits. We spit, spit, spit. We spit, spit, spit. With their spits. With their spits. With their spits. We spit, spit, spit. We spit, spit, spit. With their spits. With their spits. We spit, spit, spit. Come on, bit. You dummy. Should have started moving them pones down there. That pone.
against Senate Bill 1309. I live in Boise, Idaho, and this is important to me because bodily autonomy is a value that I hold very dearly. It is also worth mentioning that Idaho has free exercise of religion protected. And I do identify as a non-theistic Satanist, so this bill would be counter to my deeply held religious beliefs. I am a member of the Satanic Temple Idaho. You can find more information about our religion on our website, and in regards to our tenets and how this directly impacts our membership. So I wanted to go ahead and remind the legislation that that is something at play. Also, I believe that this is vehemently against medical care because, quite frankly, I don't believe any of you are medical professionals to tell me what I can and cannot do with my own body. So, yeah, I will go ahead and end my testimony there and stand for any questions.
Thank you, Amber. Other questions? Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Amber. So as a Satanist, do you think murder is okay?
I do not believe murder is okay. It is actually a value of ours to hold compassion and empathy for all creatures in accordance with reason. So, no, we do not believe murder is okay.
Okay.
Follow-up?
Thank you. Follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Amber. Do you realize that this bill does allow for the murder of some babies, for rape and incest babies, and it doesn't matter if they have a heartbeat? Do you realize that?
I'm aware that there are exceptions in the legislation regarding that. I believe, however, it is still against my right of bodily autonomy, as stated in the third tenet of my religion, which is one's body is subject to one's will alone. Actually, the exact wording is, one's body is inviolable, subject to one's will alone. So that is the precedent.
Thank you. Any further questions? Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think I've got some preconceived ideas about your religion. I'm wondering, is there any tenet with respect to blood sacrifice?
No.
Mr. Barbieri, let's make sure we keep it to the narrow focus of the bill, and it's her religion's not on trial here today.
What I'm curious about is whether or not there is a tenet with respect to the human sacrifice.
Find a way to tie it back to the bill.
Can't do that.
Okay, well, let's keep it to the bill. We got to maintain order and decorum.
Well, I can't get over the guy on the panel who said something about, do you hold to blood sacrifice? Like, what, the Satanists are sacrificing fetuses to the Dark Lord kind of thing?
Yeah, in that clip you hear two state senators, one of whom says, well, like basically implying, well, you're a Satanist, so you must be cool with murder, right? Because abortion is murder. And that's one thing, that's bad enough. But then one of her colleagues speaks up and basically is like, I don't care what you had to say, I just heard the word Satan, so I'm just going to run with it. And starts making some bizarre accusations about what Satanists believe, none of which are accurate, at least in terms of what the speaker believes. And even the Republican head of that committee had to step in, and you heard in the clip say to that person, like, dude, stick to the topic. This is not a time to have some religious debate here. I think he even said in that clip, like, can your question be relevant to what the person said? And he's like, I can't do it. Some version of that. It's like, you're giving it away. You don't actually care to be here. Why are you doing this?
I'm amazed at how people who are supposedly divinely protected are always freaking out about evil. I know Greg Locke, Tennessee pastor Greg Locke, is somebody that you follow, and I've talked about him from time to time. This is what Pastor Greg Locke said from the podium to his congregation.
We got first and last names of 6 witches that are in our church. And you know what's strange? 3 of you are in this room right now. Three of you in the room right now. You better look in my eyeballs. We ain't afraid of you, you stinking witch. You devil-worshiping Satanist witch, we cast you out in the name of Jesus Christ. We break your spells. We break your curse. We got your first name. We got your last name. We even got an address for one of you. You so much as cough wrong, and I'll expose you in front of everybody in this tent, you stinking witch. You were sent to this church to destroy us. You were sent to this church to lure us in. You were sent to this church to cast spell. Listen, some of you been sick because you befriended that witch. 2 of you in my wife's ladies' Bible study, and you know who you are, and we gonna ask you to get out, or I'll expose you in front of everybody.
The witches, he treats them like moles, like they're spies, who've infiltrated.
Yeah.
At the time of this conversation, he actually did name 2 people, and then they responded. Here's a clip.
Sometimes you gotta let people reveal themselves for who they are. If you have ever, publicly, privately, in their house, in this church, I don't care where, if you have ever been prayed over, had hands laid on you by Brian and Gina Warren, you are under a curse of witchcraft.
I'm going to go back on 11/14 of 2021. They came over to our home. Hence, we have the witch's address. We know your address and your little dog too. So all of those listening, I'm the quote-unquote witch, and he's the male warlock. There's 2 of them he's called out. I guess he's an MMA warlock, so it's the Warrens versus the warlocks. So we prayed. They heard me in the privacy of my own home, praying in tongues over them. I wasn't chanting. They received all of it. So what I did before they had gotten here is I took a piece of paper, and I think I'm gonna go ahead and do it right now, even though it's in the video. Here's the jar. So let's go ahead and open the jar, and we got 4 of them. I went to Walmart that day when I knew they were coming, and I got 4 little glass jars, and I put a piece of paper in it, and what it says is Judges 7:20, 11/14, 2021, Gina Guy Warren, Truth and Love Ministries, and it's the scripture. There you go. There's the witch's covenant, everybody. Do you understand how reckless this is?
See, the point you're trying to make, that did sound like a threat. And the threat is that it's not really about Satan or the devil or witches. It's saying, if you cross me, if you get in my way, I'm going to make your life a living hell. Because I'm the one in the pulpit and you're the one out there. So the message was really not about the witches. The message is, don't get in my way. I'm going to come after you and publicly shame you if you cross me. And that, to me, is the more frightening thing about that story. Because anybody could be a witch. Anyone. I think he even said later, a couple of them were men. It could be anyone in his congregation who dares to challenge him.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I will. Aren't there allegations of domestic abuse with this guy? I mean, doesn't he have a checkered past, some real red flags that we should be aware of?
It's questionable, and I say that for a reason. There was one article about his ex-wife that came out a few years ago that made a lot of suggestions about, at the very least, emotional abuse. However, and this is why I'm kind of hedging here, all of those things were posted by a conservative Christian website whose journalistic credibility I don't quite take for granted. You know what I mean?
I get that. Well, I don't want to be part of perpetrating something that's totally unsubstantiated just because I despise the man.
I do think it's worth bringing up because I do hear this allegation come up every now and then, but I think this is what's important to realize. There's no lawsuit, no criminal allegation against the guy. It's a lot of hearsay, and I don't trust the source. And so that's kind of what people should go in. But what I have seen, and what is proven, is that these clips that you shared, many of them that come from his sermons on a regular basis, are easily portrayed. I mean, I think you could easily say it's an emotional manipulation. It's, religious abuse in a way, because he's basically saying, you got to be with my church and my way of thinking, or I'm going to cast you as the enemy, and I'm going to make sure very cult-like here. I'm going to make sure everyone in this congregation shuns you if you cross my path.
We got some people under this tent right now. You have the hardest time keeping your mouth shut about your church. So I'm going to sit here for about 15 seconds and just give you a chance to leave anytime you want to. Because we need your seat anyhow, you complaining judgmental Pharisee. You can leave anytime you want to. I'm just going to sit here for a minute and let you walk out. If you can call me out behind closed doors, why don't you be man enough, put on your big boy pants, stand up and walk out right now in front of everybody, you coward. You critical hypocrite, you Pharisee. If you think I'm going to stop just because you want me to, you have lost your mind. I'm just getting started good.
I worry a lot about his ilk of pastor really calling people, to physical violence, right? Christian jihad. This, to hear, this sounds funny when I say it, but the violence in his language. He's very much a fight. I'm in your face. We're not going to take it. Go get him. Don't you dare, And I know that there's a culture of people that responds to that tone that I think could be easily sort of nudged into a physical attack against what they consider to be the infidel, right?
Yeah, this is what's scary to me about preachers like him and a lot of those new independent fundamentalist Baptist preachers, which Greg Locke is not, but they're kind of in that same mold, which is, I don't think Greg Locke is the sort of person who would commit an act of violence like the kind you're talking about. I don't think so. However, I could not say the same about the people who attend those churches. And it's a very Trumpian sort of thing here. Did the guy at the top commit the crime? Maybe, maybe not. But he sure as hell knows how to whip his followers into a frenzy, so maybe they'll do some of it and take the fall if anything happens.
I'm just now calling out Joe Biden. I'm just now preaching against the LGBTQ community. I'm just now calling out abortion. I'm just now talking about election fraud. I'm just now talking about Antifa. And
that little pillow, is it in there? No, maybe. Always on the floor, Chris. Yeah, this stop. What do you need that pillow for? I'm washing it. I wanted to wash it. Oh my gosh, you got... Okay, might be tomorrow we're going to get it here clean. Thanks, I can't even get that to wash the pillow. There's a spit of it, girl.
And Black Lives Matter. I'm just now calling out this wicked nonsense.
I'm interested in the othering, the dehumanization. Joe Jones, pastor of Shield of Faith Baptist Church in Boise, Idaho. He's been on the radar of organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and others. He condones the mistreatment of all non-heterosexuals. Here's a clip.
I've read Genesis 19. You've read Genesis 19. We've read Judges 19. It is not very kind. It is not very sensitive. And it's not very compassionate to those people. Now, it is to us. Right? I think if God were to rain down fire and brimstone on all these queers, that is kind. That is compassionate. Right? That is a blessing to us because those people are monsters.
This is what I think people don't really understand, which is there are dozens at least of these new independent fundamentalist Baptist churches. The way they preach is very fire and brimstone and the kind of thing you thought went out of style a long time ago. But the thing is, they are all about the Old Testament. They do not preach extensively about Jesus the way a lot of evangelical preachers might. They talk very much about the rules and laws of the Old Testament as if they were not, wiped clean by Jesus. And so the scary thing is, guys like Joe Jones, guys like Jonathan Shelley, they really just spend so much of their time focusing on these laws. I think a lot of Christians would argue, they don't count anymore or whatever. They can rationalize them away. These guys focus on those laws. They preach sermons about those laws. They do not hold back in talking about it. And it's amazing how fast and how fast these churches have blossomed, how many of them there are. If you did a panoramic view of their audience, they don't necessarily have big churches. But the thing these pastors know better than most is that they're not playing to the crowd in the room. They're playing to the crowd online, where they can be radicalized like that.
Pastor Jonathan Shelley, Steadfast Bible Church, Hurst, Texas. Terrifying clip. Let me play it for you. He's preaching this in the front 5 rows, sitting on the floor. Young children.
This is exactly what God wants in the New Testament. Did you realize that? Yeah. Because you know what? Fornicators aren't welcome in the church. So if there's a whore, she's supposed to be thrown out until she repents and gets back in. And then on top of that, the sodomites never allowed in for any vow. Oh, I promise I'm saved. No, get away. I love the Lord. No, you don't. Get away from me. Love is love. No, there's no promise you could make. There's nothing you can say. You're never welcome. Go away.
Amen. Yeah.
I just can't wait until you just go to hell.
Right.
Because there's no place for them.
Shelley was just evicted, right? I mean, his landlord said, get the hell out of here. By the way, I was exposing some of his hate speech on Facebook, and then Facebook banned me. Guess what they banned me for, Emmett? Hate speech.
Yeah. I'm sorry for that, by the way.
I posted your tweet about it, and Facebook gave me a 30-day strike. It is under review and probably will be till the day I die. But he was evicted. Take me from that point, if you would.
Yeah, you showed the clip where he's preaching with children in the front row. The reason they had all that space in the front row is because he got evicted and had to find a temporary residence somewhere else for his church. But yeah, basically, a lot of these churches, they're not big enough to command their own buildings. They don't have enough money to kind of create their own thing. They rent out like areas in strip malls and things like that to hold their church services. Put up a little background behind you, get a little bit of lighting, and guess what? You're fit for YouTube. You know what I mean?
It's going beyond just saying you do all this wicked stuff. It's saying you enjoy it. You enjoy murder. You enjoy malignity. You enjoy hating God. Look, there's only one group that enjoys that. It's the pride parades going up and down the street. Yeah. And you know, it's great when trucks accidentally go through those, parades. I think only one person died, so hopefully we can hope for more in the future. You say, well, that's mean. Yeah, but the Bible says that they're worthy of death. You say, are you sad when fags die? No, I think it's great. I hope they all die. I would love it if every fag would die right now.
And so Jonathan Shelley was doing that for several years. He said so many horrible, hateful, anti-gay things over the years that I guess after there were protests, because he recently said something over the top even for him, there were protests outside the entire strip mall against him. And I think the landlord was just fed up and had an out in their contract that said, if you're preaching hate speech, that's a legitimate legal ground for me to evict you from my property, and that's exactly what this landlord seems to have done.
Literally, these disgusting, filthy will try to get people drunk so they can do weird things to them. And you don't even know. You don't even know someone like that because they all hide and they all, deceive. And because our world is just filled with so many metro, effeminate, queer-looking dudes, it's hard to even realize who's a anymore.
Amen. So he gets evicted. And all of a sudden, you got all these backup pastors. I think one may have been in his own church. How is it legal, even behind a pulpit, to call for the actual execution of gay people?
They're predators. They're bullies. They're imposing their will on people. That's why God says just put them to death. Because you can't reason with them. They don't do anything good for society. They bring nothing to the
New
table
Testament, you're
at all in our society.
Christians are not allowed to kill them.
Pedophiles, and they're sick and disgusting, and anyone with a normal brain knows that they're sick and disgusting. Our country used to squash the sodomite problem like a bug.
I wish they still did.
It's called stone them with stone. It's called hang them. It's called firing squad. It's called, they get ran over by a truck by another sodomite. I don't care how they die. If they're worthy of death, why would I care the method of which they die?
Let me say two things. One is, to answer your question, how is it legal? None of these pastors, I'm not trying to defend them, but here's the excuse they make. I am not calling for the execution of gay people. I am not telling anyone in this church to do that. I'm saying in an ideal biblical world, the government would make it a crime punishable by death.
This is basically a perfect illustration of what happened to Pastor Shelley at Steadfast. Is that, these fags were basically, they told
fags.
him, hey, protest this church.
You ain't gonna
and
bleep
then
out
twist
my
his
words
to say that, he said that we should be
Faggots.
killing fags or whatever. And he clearly said that it should be government sanctioned, that the government, it's their job.
That is their way of, circling the square, however you want to say that. That's their defense here. But ultimately, they're saying it would be cool if we could do that. The government ought to do that. A lot of this really began with a guy named Steven Anderson in Arizona, and there are literally dozens of these churches, mostly in the United States. But yeah, after Jonathan Shelley got evicted, they used that persecution claim as if, you guys, they're all coming after us too because they hate the Bible, because they hate Christians. That's the rhetoric they're using to their congregations and their online audiences.
By the way, Jonathan Shelley, I know he did a sermon recently on, he mentioned whores in one of his sermons, but he's got this take on the biblical woman, and I'm going somewhere with this. But as I'm playing this litany of clips, I got to play the context. Pastor Jonathan Shelley regarding the biblical woman.
We see the Nancy Pelosi's of this world. We see the Kamala Harris's of this world. We see the work that they're doing. And that's why I reject women in any position of authority or leadership. It makes me mad. Every time I drive up and down the street, there's this stupid billboard or this stupid little poster I see for Pamela Bogus or something running for judge. And I'm thinking, what a curse unto our nation. She's a conservative. She's a Republican. Well, get in the kitchen and start making conservative sandwiches.
Our leaders are women.
Where in the Bible does it say that, oh, here's the virtuous woman, she's the judge? No, her husband's in the gate. Her husband's the judge. Her husband's the ruler.
My first thought, obviously, is, all right, well, these are a bunch of, whiny, bigoted, privileged white guys who are talking about all this stuff. How convenient, God put us in charge, is what they're saying. But when you look at the transformed wife on Twitter, you realize it's not just a dude. By the way, if you want a horror show, it's the Twitter handle is @godlywomanhood. I'm just going to throw it out. The transformed wife. Your thoughts, Hemet Mehta.
I've been a can I say fan? It's not bad. I've been following this person online for so many years because it's not just Twitter. She has a blog where she says this stuff. She has her YouTube channel where she says this stuff. She's a real human. She is not a troll or a parody, no matter what you think.
That's my next question. I mean, she's not just looking for clicks. When she posts something that says, building a marriage upon whether or not a husband meets the wife's emotional needs is why up to 80% of divorces are initiated by women. Her whole take is that women need to only think about the man, subservient. They shouldn't go to college. They shouldn't get a job. They certainly shouldn't be in the pulpit. The transformed wife.
Yeah, which is weird because she doesn't take even though she probably believes the same stuff, she doesn't go down the anti-gay route, LGBTQ route, like she does about women. But yeah, her whole shtick is, let me tell you how to be a good Christian wife. And it's a very fundamentalist Christian brand of womanhood, which says, if you are not a virgin, there's something wrong with you. Which says, hey ladies, if your husband wants sex, you must have it with him. I believe she once said, don't worry, it won't take long.
Oh my God.
But this is her whole thing. It's a woman ought to be submissive, obedient, a good housewife. There is nothing else you could possibly want out of life. And any deviation from that is awful. And obviously the question comes up, if that's what you want in life, so be it. But what if your husband is abusive, physically abusive, emotionally abusive, and she very much is doesn't care, doesn't matter, especially if it's emotional abuse. She does not care. You stay in the marriage no matter what. And it's just so harmful. It's so damning. And she just goes, I mean, she believes this stuff. It's not an act for her.
She posted a quote from Christian apologist, evangelist, and dinosaur John MacArthur. Hell, he's been around since I was in Christian radio 30 years ago. And a quote that said, "Women pastors and women preachers are the most obvious evidence of churches rebelling against the Bible." I mean, you got to give them credit, though. Instead of sort of hand-fashioning a cafeteria plan, happy, clappy, Jesus is love kind of religion. I mean, they're quoting the Bible. I mean, I guess credit's not the word, but yeah.
Right. Like, you do not, under any circumstances, have to hand it to them. Yeah, they will quote whatever they want to quote from the Bible. And again, I'm not suggesting they have it right and, progressive Christians have it wrong or anything like that. But they very much care about certain passages over others. They do not care about the big picture. And more importantly, whether it's the transformed wife, Lori Alexander, or John MacArthur, or John Piper, or whichever of these funny preachers you want to talk about, they do not care if anyone is hurt by their words, by their rhetoric, or by living the lifestyle that they are calling for. Because this is the thing we've seen in recent years, which is, like you said, guys like MacArthur have been around for decades and decades. What's relatively new is how many more women who grew up in those churches and who got married and lived their lives in accordance with what those people are preaching, they are now coming out and saying, I needed to get out. It was the right thing for me to leave that relationship or end that marriage. I am a better person today because of it. Let me tell you my story because it's harmful. I don't want other women going down the same path. And the thing that's surprising is not just how many of those stories there are, it's how little people like MacArthur or Lori Alexander, it's how little they care about any of that. Those stories do not exist in their bubble.
Well, the whole goddamn thing is just sexual shame, targeted toward, mostly toward women. I mean, if you can control someone's identity, their sexual identity, then you're in their rooms, their private spaces, their thoughts, their worth, their futures, their relationships. It's insidious, right?
If I can back up for a second, I think you said a little bit ago with some of those new IFB preachers that it was these cis white men, and I those stories do not exist in their bubble.
Well, the whole goddamn thing is just sexual shame, targeted toward, mostly toward women. I mean, if you can control someone's identity, their sexual identity, then you're in their rooms, their private spaces, their thoughts, their worth, their futures, their relationships. It's insidious, right?
If I can back up for a second, I think you said a little bit ago with some of those new IFB preachers that it was these cis white men. And I just want to clarify, they are not all white. In fact, a good chunk of them really do cater to a Hispanic audience too, especially in Texas. And almost all of them that can do it have Spanish services on weekends. And I don't know the language well, so I don't listen to those sermons as much, but I have to think they're saying many of the same things in another language. So, they're slowly expanding who they're reaching, and the scary thing is no matter how often YouTube cuts them off, they will pop back up. That violates YouTube's terms of services, but they will pop back up under a new channel. And Steven Anderson, the ringleader of it all, is so bad as a human, he has literally been banned from stepping foot in I think 36 countries. He cannot enter the countries. He's on their list.
That's good for them. Maybe we'll be next. Well, obviously, there's somebody mashing in the comments section right now. Free speech. Hashtag free speech. Right. We have to protect the worst speech in order. I mean, we don't want to just protect the speech we like. I understand that argument to a degree. But I'm not a free speech absolutist. I used to be back in the day, but now I really do think, terms of service, you are signing a contract, sometimes a legitimate, sometimes a social contract. If you are full of venom and toxicity and hate, and I don't think we can say, well, it's all subjective. Like some people think it's love. I think we can call it what it is. You know, if Twitter bans Greg Locke, he's not a free speech martyr, right?
Right. And that's the thing. If YouTube cuts off their channel, that is not a violation of free speech. You broke the rules of YouTube. If you're cut off from Twitter, or you get evicted from the strip mall space you're renting, that has nothing to do with free speech. And here's the thing. This hurts those new IFB preachers more than anything else, because YouTube has been their platform for them to spread their hate. They need YouTube. Sure, could they make their own website where they upload videos on their own and post it? Yeah, they could. And by the way, no one's saying they can't do it. They have that right to do it, but they don't want to. That's not what would make them, they wouldn't be happy knowing they have that outlet. What makes them happy is trolling other people or getting in front of new eyes on YouTube, hoping someone's going down the rabbit hole of this stuff and finding them. That is what they're counting on. And it's the argument I would make for why I don't think, like, Trump's social network will ever amount to anything, because these people don't want to talk to each other. They're not interested in the followers who are already there. They're interested in reaching a new crowd that they could never get on their own. And for a long time, YouTube, especially YouTube, was helping them do it. And now it's almost funny to watch how they kind of try to evade the system. I mean, Jonathan Shelley, a guy we talked about already, he does not have one YouTube channel. He has many, and he'll post the same sermon live on all of them. And if one goes down, he tells his little followers, I need you to start up a channel and start posting these on yours. And you're falling for the cult leader ultimately.
So they're just walking between the raindrops kind of thing. Well, but if I can camp out here for just a second, I want to get to a couple of really wackadoodle clips that you've posted.
Yeah.
I mean, with Parler and some of these right-wing social media pods, I worry, not just that they want to troll the rest of us. Don't those function as a kind of subgroup where they can spin whatever wackadoodle conspiracies and hate, etc., unchecked or relatively unchecked? In other words, they'll never be challenged, and they can just spin themselves into a lather. I mean, that's one of the purposes of sites like that, right?
Yeah, it is. But again, if you think about what their goal is and the reason these guys have the notoriety that they've come to have, it's because they are not satisfied with talking to the people they already have. Of course, they can always speak in an echo chamber, but no one's going to care if they're speaking in an echo chamber. The thing that gives them power is that they've used, I want to use secular in big quote words, they've used secular, non-partisan outlets to spread their hate speech, and losing that channel, I mean, it would be great for everybody, but losing that channel is kind of their biggest fear, because they are not interested in talking to each other. They're not interested in preaching the gospel every week to a small church of, a small crowd. They don't care.
All right.
They are aiming for the wider audience, and having to force them to move to Rumble or Gab or Parler or anything like that.
Gag is probably better, yeah.
Having to move to that stuff would cut them off from what they actually want to do. Now, they have found ways of trying to spread their stuff to a wider audience. They've tried to branch out into new ways of preaching that's less homophobic outright. It just doesn't really seem to get anywhere with them. It's only when they go over the top that people give them attention, and I realize I have a role to play in that in some capacity, but also I think more sunlight on who these people are, put Christians on the defensive as to hey, what's up with who's preaching the Bible? Make them have to defend these people, you know what I mean?
Well, I think that's the next question, though, Hemet. I mean, I get the vibe some of them are kind of riding the coattails of larger channels, hoping that we'll give them some oxygen. And I go back and forth. Part of me is thinking, do I really want to give him attention? And the other part of me is like, he's got some shitty ideas, and ideas have to earn respect, so let's highlight the bad ideas. Do you wrestle with that question, how much oxygen do I give awful people?
Sometimes. I will tell you this, as someone who was for a long time an atheist activist, in the sense that I wanted people to become an atheist. I honestly don't care about that so much anymore, necessarily, but there's a couple ways you could do that. One is trying to make the argument as to why atheism makes sense. This is the Richard Dawkins God delusion sort of arguments. Here's why apologetics, Christian apologists are wrong. Here's the logical argument for atheism. You can do that. It'll reach some people. It definitely has. But there's another side of it, which is, let me show you what happens. Religion is not a virtue. Let me show you what people who you cannot doubt that they believe this stuff, let me show you what they're doing with it. And obviously there's no shortage of Christians who are in the news for doing something awful. There's no shortage of Catholic priests or Mormon leaders who get exposed for, abuse. And in the case of these guys, these are people who believe in a very fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. I'm not saying all these other Christians accept that, but this guy really believes this stuff, and I'm putting that out there. And it's not because I think people are suddenly going to be like, oh, I guess Christianity is wrong, but it will make them squirm a little bit if they're a believer. And by the way, sometimes it's just pointing out, look where this could lead you. Look, most Christians I personally know are awesome. They're fine. I don't care that they believe something I disagree with. But the thing is, don't make an argument that religion makes you a good person. Don't make the argument that if you just read the Bible, you would be a better person. Because here are some examples of people who are clearly, unequivocally horrible people. And I do think shining a spotlight on that. Imagine let me go with a more familiar one, Westboro Baptist Church, which was kind of the sort of people we are talking about here for such a long time. There's always an argument. Do you give them publicity every time they do a publicity stunt? Or do you just, it's not a big church, just let them do their thing and maybe they'll go away. They're not going to go away. And by highlighting how horrible they are and how horrible the things they say are, you actually kind of can shift it over to the point where, no one wants to be like them. So if you want to fight that, even if you're a Christian and you don't want to be associated with them, your job is to move in that direction.
It's funny. I'm going to camp out on something you said. I've got a couple of clips I'm just aching to play here. But you said you're not all that interested in making someone, whether or not someone's an atheist. And, for someone who is host of The Friendly Atheist, and I don't even have that on your super on screen. I think I've got the Only Sky link and your tweet.
If you go to friendlyatheist.com, it'll take you there too.
Yeah, I host The Thinking Atheist, which is an icon representing reason over faith. But I feel you in some ways. I've heard it, well, you want to make everybody in the world an atheist. And I think, no, I want to encourage other people to carve their own path and do their own thinking. I think if they do that, and they are honest about the evidence, they're probably going to lean far away from superstitions. They may become atheists, but my goal is not to rubber stamp atheism on everybody. And I'm guessing that's where you're going with that. And if I can elaborate, there's a perception among some atheists that, atheist, rational, good, religious people, stupid, bad. And it just makes my brain melt. One of my best friends in the world and next door neighbor is a worship pastor at a nearby church. Yeah. Okay. He is one of the best people I know. He's not the best because of what he believes. He's got a genuinely good. He offered to drive me to the airport to go to an atheist conference to speak. He just loves people, right? He just accepts me for who I am. And so, I feel you in the sense that my mission is not to convert or deconvert him. It's more about encouragement to be your own person in the hopes that rationality will prevail. I don't know. You take that where you want, brother. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a lot of it. I'm not keeping a tally board somewhere if someone becomes an atheist because of anything I do. I'm glad you are. If that's the case, good. Congratulations. Give yourself a pat on the back. You don't have to tell me about it. I don't care. If you deconvert, do it on your own time. It's all well and good. But I have no problem with progressive religious people who are pushing for who share my values, who are pushing for those things into law. Do we have a disagreement about God? Yes, we do. We probably have a disagreement on lots of things. But for me, the bigger picture is, what are you doing with whatever your beliefs are? Hey, listen, we could have a different conversation about atheists who have gone in crazy directions too. So being an atheist is not the end-all be-all of anything anymore. But I hope if I can offer anything to people who end up reading my stuff or watching anything I do, I would hope religious people are watching it, understanding where I'm coming from on it, and agreeing with me on how horrible some of this stuff is.
And I say the same thing about the 21st century Republican Party, who are aghast about the insurrection and they're against Christian nationalism. There's a few, Kristen Dumais wrote the book Jesus and John Wayne, and we've got, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Yes. They've got the website, and they've concentrated efforts, and I think those sort of, for lack of a better word, interfaith efforts are critical if we're going to change the culture, right?
Yeah. You need more of that. You need it. And, I mean, Kristen Dumais' book is fantastic. Adam Kinzinger is from Illinois, the House member. He's been a very relatively progressive Republican on the Trump stuff, wrong about a bunch of other things. But I'm saying those voices matter. And it helps when they're not the only people doing it. And so as long as there is a space to be created where those voices, someone who is a progressive Christian who calls out the toxic masculinity within church circles and the abuse and the spiritual manipulation, when you have religious people saying that, calling it out, we need to help them out. We need to be on their side for those things and not just say, well, they're Christians, so they're ultimately wrong about this, or they're Republicans, so they're ultimately wrong about this, or whatever it is. Like, no, you got to one right place. Good for you. Keep going.
Well, if you'll forgive my extremely awkward and perhaps a clumsy segue, I wonder how those progressive Christians would approach someone like a guy that you post. I see a clip about every 3 or 4 days, and they're just awesome. Robin Bullock, the pastor with the long hair, looks like an 80s hairband.
Yeah, Silly Ray Cyrus.
Church International, and that's kind of a generic name, but that's the name of his church. Church International. And he's got a new jam every 5 minutes. I mean, just untethered to reality. But let me play you a clip. This is his explanation for Noah's Ark. How a 500-year-old dude could single-handedly build a stadium-sized boat out of trees. Check it out.
And you have to ask yourself this. How did he move those timbers around?
Yeah.
How did he pick up those timbers and move them around? Well, there's something called, everything has a frequency.
Yeah.
This AirPod case has a frequency. If you could, because it's made of matter, if you could match the frequency of this AirPod case, and you knew what it was, and you could match it, you could pick it up off the ground without touching it, just through sound. It had to be moved with sound. Well, that's brilliance of mind that we don't possess right now. See, all the technology just actually showed how dumb man has become in comparison to how smart Noah and Adam and all of them were.
Hammett, you followed this guy. Like, is he real?
Unfortunately.
Is he just checked out of the hotel reality and you post him for amusement? What's going on there?
So Robin Bullock is more of a guy, Right Wing Watch has kept tabs on him for a number of years. There's a lot of these charismatic, I wouldn't call it evangelical, but these are people who really have built a huge audience online. You said, is Robin Bullock real? I don't know about his hair, but the preaching, he's been doing it long enough that it doesn't just seem like an act.
Yeah.
But these people genuinely believe every miracle is real, that anything that floats into their mind must be God talking to them, and they have nothing holding them back from making predictions about politics, because they know no one who actually watches them in good faith, unlike they know no one's going to challenge them or go back and check their predictions, that they made months ago.
The only reason you say that is because you're operating on the wrong your frequency is not tuned. Your frequency
right.
properly attuned.
And That's why I haven't made a boat.
One more real fast, just to get your reaction. Sean McDowell, he's one of these sort of, I don't know, he looks like the typical Life Church youth group the hip pastor kind of dude. And he's got a website. He recently went on TikTok. He wanted to give us a handy and helpful explanation as to why disasters and disease are actually a demonstration of God's love.
Well, what about earthquakes? What about diseases? What about natural fires? What about all that stuff? Like, why would a loving father allow that to happen?
Yeah, actually, God has given us those because He is good. We need earthquakes within our ecosystem to survive as human beings. Things like forest fires. We actually need forest fires to recycle some of the plants that are in different ecosystems. What about viruses? We actually need viruses. They help limit the amount of bacteria that spreads, and if we didn't have viruses, we wouldn't stop them. Now, the Bible does say that the world was cursed. So somehow in the sin at Romans 3, it might have affected the magnitude of earthquakes. It might have affected the kind of viruses.
Why can't God say no earthquake, period?
But I do know that we actually need those very things to survive in our environment and flourish. So I think because God is loving, He's actually given us those things.
Kind of a self-flagellation model there, you know. It's all good unless it's not good, but it's still good. And if it's a fallen world, it's our fault. But,
and if it's bad, it's only bad through our limited viewpoints, and we don't know what God knows and all that. So, and here's the thing. His dad is Josh McDowell, who is a famous Christian apologist. Sean's followed in those footsteps as an apologist. So trying to explain all the things people would normally bring up as examples of why God doesn't exist, that is his whole jam right there. But I was actually surprised because I watch his TikTok videos, and I've been on stage with him for an event once. Like, all these people are fine in person. But the thing that's surprising about the clip you just played is that for someone who is a professional Christian apologist, that struck me as just a horrible answer for such a common question. Because it just downplayed how awful natural disasters and earthquakes and giant fires could
cancer. You know, if a child gets leukemia, it's just more evidence that God loves us as the overall
and I'm not saying all Christians may not be able to give you a solid answer on, like, why would God allow kids to get brain cancer or something like that, but you would expect a guy like McDowell to have a really good, firm, strong, tested answer that at least works for a crowd. And I watched that particular one, and I'm like, I was taken aback by how bad of a justification that was.
Well, it's frustrating too with the ever-moving goalposts. You know, it's one of those things where God is demonstrated, the proof of Him is everywhere. Unless He is hidden, He makes total sense and lets His mysterious ways. God has made sense of His intelligent design unless He is using the foolish things to confound the wise.
It's a whole religion based on heads I win, tails you lose.
God uses the horrible stuff to build our faith, or it's pain in this life, bliss in the next, or it's our fault, or it's an attack of Satan. I mean, it's just unbelievable to watch them move the chess pieces around so that they can ultimately feel like they won the game. Any final thoughts, Hemet Meta, about what you're doing these days? I want to make sure we connect people with you and your work, but I mean, beyond posting, the clips of Robin Bullock and exposing the hate preachers and trying to make a more inclusive world, what are you up to these days, brother?
I've been writing what I hope are more substantive posts at Only Sky, which that link is down there, which has been nice. It's not writing about every single idiot who happens to profess a religious belief and gets in the news, but I hope it's more substantive, more in-depth, and still the sort of thing I would hope a religious person can read and say, I agree with everything you said. I mean, that's kind of the hope there. So I've been writing those articles. If you're on YouTube right now, please go to the Friendly Atheist channel and subscribe. Just search for it. You'll find me there. I'm going through the Bible chapter by chapter, and we're in all of those sections that all those hate preachers love to cite right now. And if you want to see those clips as I come across them, I usually post them on Twitter, because Twitter usually lets me do it and doesn't give me a Facebook ban.
Well, I mean, that's a slog. I was going through, and I've been working on a project on the Bible that's going to take years, but you know, when you get into Leviticus.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I mean, you know, it's like migraine-inducing, numbing slog through the Old Testament rules and.
Oh my God, dude!
Just insane.
Yes, I agree. I need therapy now. I think.
I'll link everything in the description box to make sure people can hook up with you. And if you want to see, you know, the occasional wackadoodle clip, make sure you have subscribed and followed Hemet on Twitter, etc. Appreciate all the work you're doing. Thanks for having the conversation with me. I'm sure we'll cross paths again, okay?
Of course. Thanks for everything you do, Seth.
No. No. Get that whore out of here. Slut. Man, she smells like spit. No.
Thank you all for joining us tonight, and it's my pleasure to welcome a close friend, UC San Diego's Distinguished Professor Emeritus in Psychiatry, Joel Dimsdale. I'm sure many of you know Joel and his incredible scholarship and service to UC San Diego. He joined UC San Diego back in 1985 after serving on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School, and even in his retirement continues to consult and engage in research. In addition to being a respected scholar, Joel's an incredible friend and supporter of the library. And in fact, just last year, Joel donated a collection of Holocaust survivor interviews that he collected in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I'm glad to report that just this past week, we finished digitizing those collections. Joel is with us tonight to speak about his new book, Dark Persuasion, A History of Brainwashing from Pavlov to Social Media. In this book, Joel traces the evolution of brainwashing from its beginnings in torture and religious conversion into the age of neuroscience and social media. I just finished reading the book this past weekend and just am so excited to have Joel with us tonight. And so with that, Joel, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here at Geisel tonight. And I'd like to give a shout out to Geisel and all the research libraries in the world. These are repositories of learning and wisdom that are deeply valuable for our society. And I'd also like to thank all of you who've joined us this evening. You know, when I tell people that I've been interested in brainwashing, the typical response is, Joel, this reeks of musty Cold War stuff and bad science and ethically challenged scientists. Well, that's partially true, but it is not. It's not something that is only from 100 years ago. Brainwashing or coercive persuasion continues to be active and to develop even a century later. And yes, there were some bad scientists involved, but there were also Nobel laureates involved. And some were ethically challenged. But I think the story of brainwashing is really the history of those individuals and the social forces they were caught up in. So I'd like to give you an overview of my book by highlighting some of the 20th century events where brainwashing has been evoked. Throughout this talk, please consider two questions. Was this event a manifestation of brainwashing? And what aspects of the event shaped your opinion? Well, in my previous book, Anatomy of Malice, I focused on understanding how state leaders could orchestrate malice on a genocidal level. Subsequently, I started wondering about how a population could be persuaded to follow such a path. Were they inherently murderous, as Daniel Goldhagen suggested? Were they hoodwinked by propaganda? Or were they brainwashed? And what did that term even mean? Where did it come from? Even despite my interest in the topic, I would probably never have written the book if it weren't for my neighbors who were members of the Heaven's Gate commune. A few miles away from us, our neighbors had themselves castrated and then committed a mass suicide so they could teleport to the stars. It's one thing when there's a suicidal cult half a world away, but when it's your neighbors, it demands study. And so I began my work on dark persuasion. Now, before we go into this very far, we need to ask a question about terminology, and it's a very important topic, particularly with brainwashing. It's such a flamboyant term. What does this term mean? There are lots of other terms that refer to aspects of persuasion, indoctrination, conversion, propaganda, or even education. But in its essence, brainwashing involves duress or intimidation. Frequently, the victim is isolated and subjected to harm while being manipulated. The best term is coercive persuasion, but the word brainwashing vastly dominates the general usage. People have been coerced by torture for centuries, but it's not so clear that torture changes actual belief. Religious conversion, likewise, is an old process that has sometimes been coerced. But the beginning of coercive persuasion dates to the Russian Nobel laureate Ivan Pavlov, who brought scientific methods to changing behavior. For decades, the West was preoccupied that Pavlov and the Soviets had made some kind of unholy alliance to change people's beliefs and actions. As the CIA observed, Soviet psychology is concerned with the concepts of Pavlov, the belief that men can be deliberately made to develop pre-designed types of thoughts and behaviors. Some of Pavlov's observations stemmed from an unusual natural phenomenon, the flooding of the Neva River. Let me read a portion from the beginning of my book to describe what happened. The dogs were restless, penned in their cages in the basement of the Institute of Experimental Medicine. They were alone and weary from their daytime jobs in the professor's laboratory. But it wasn't the dark or the isolation or fatigue that got to them. It was the incessant dripping and lapping of water on the floor of their kennel. Although it started out as a fairly typical overcast day, the rain increased until the Neva River once again flooded, and it headed straight for the dogs. The water level in the kennel rose, and the dogs started barking. At first, their paws sloshed around in the chilly water, but as the hours went by, the water covered their bellies and shoulders until they were half floating in their cages, with their nostrils pressed anxiously against the wire mesh in the cages. They howled in fear and desperately snuffled the air. At the last moment, a dog handler raced through the flooded streets to the Institute, where he encountered panicked dogs and floating cages. One by one, he rescued the dogs, but first he had to force their heads under the water to get them out of the cages. The dogs were never the same. Their dispositions changed dramatically. The meek became aggressive and the gregarious became shy. It was as if an entirely new being inhabited each dog. This was bad enough, but the researchers were also struck by the fact that the dogs had forgotten all of the complex learning they had acquired in the laboratory. The dogs' memories were wiped clean. The staff talked about the dogs' memory loss for weeks, and the scientists wrote their colleagues about this strange event. This might have been dismissed as a curiosity, except that it took place in the laboratory of the Nobel laureate Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov built his career on meticulous observation and experimentation. For the rest of his life, he talked about the flood, and his comments about traumatic stress and memory reverberated widely, given his relationship with Russia's communist leaders. This would all have led just to scientific papers, except for Lenin's interests. He visited Pavlov's laboratory and asked Pavlov's help in molding the new Soviet man to build the new world of communism. Pavlov asked, "Do you mean you would like to standardize the population of Russia? Make them all behave in the same way?" Lenin said, "Exactly, and you will help us." The Soviets handsomely supported Pavlov, funded him with over 350 researchers for his institutes. Stalin also protected Pavlov, even during the Great Terror, when Stalin attacked so many prominent Russians. Pavlov was safe. There has always been a suspicion that Pavlov influenced how prominent party officials were interrogated and induced to make unusual confessions during the show trials. Bukharin was the principal target of the third show trial. Charged with plotting to assassinate Lenin and Stalin and give Soviet territories to Japan, Germany, and Great Britain. He abjectly confessed to it all, saying, "I have no intention of recanting anything I have confessed. The monstrousness of my crimes is immeasurable. Other leading Soviets similarly confessed, saying things like, "There is no country on earth filled with such happy people. Farewell, my beloved country." Observers wondered how the Soviets extracted such confessions. They used a mixture of techniques, including solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, constant interrogation, and demands for confession. They alternated brutality and kindness, all imposed methodically and patiently, like a scientific experiment. When Pavlov died in 1949, a glowing obituary in Pravda commented on his accomplishments in achieving unlimited power over the work of the brain. It is interesting that in the ensuing cases of coercive persuasion in the 20th century, Pavlov's name is invariably mentioned. When World War II broke out, the Allies and Axis countries turned away from a preoccupation with show trials and confession and focused instead on drugs for interrogation, or as they called it, truth serum. Could a way be found to extract information from the enemy rapidly and reliably? Could one protect one's own agents or soldiers from disclosing secrets under truth serum? Truth serums were drugs that were redeployed for new purposes. In obstetrics, various drugs were studied to help the pain of childbirth. They became popular after Jon Snow treated Queen Victoria with chloroform. German doctors found that a combination of scopolamine and morphine was safe and effective in eliciting what they called Dämmerschlaf, or twilight sleep. In 1916, Ferris, Texas obstetrician Robert House performed a home delivery in a farmhouse using the twilight sleep protocol. He observed a curious phenomenon. After delivering the baby, he looked around for a kitchen scale to weigh the child. No one knew where it was. When the mother, who was still under anesthesia, piped up and said, "The scales are in the kitchen on the nail behind the picture." House was intrigued. He became convinced that twilight sedation made it impossible to lie. Furthermore, he was convinced that the jails were full of people who were wrongly convicted. Sheriffs, prosecutors, and defense attorneys sought him out to interrogate prisoners to learn the truth. His technique rapidly achieved worldwide prominence. This illustration of Dr. House and a prison inmate comes from a textbook of forensic psychiatry published in Spain almost a century ago. Meanwhile, psychiatrists were experimenting with drugs to treat catatonia, fugue, or dissociative memory loss and battle fatigue. Various barbiturate compounds could get patients talking and remembering. My old professor Lindemann noted that after administering barbiturates, there was a feeling of well-being and serenity, a desire to communicate, a willingness to speak about very personal problems usually not spoken of to strangers. These observations on drugs and truth-telling were of great importance to the military in World War II. The Nazis experimented on Dachau prison concentration camp inmates, spiking their coffee with mescaline to see if people would confide their secrets. The Nazis noted that the prisoners became more talkative, but were unconvinced about the drug's utility for military purposes. Meanwhile, the United States set up a secret commission to study if truth drugs algorithms could be developed to speed interrogation of prisoners of war. Curiously, they focused a great deal on marijuana. The OSS worked with leading academics to study how useful such drugs were and to investigate if people could really be compelled to tell the truth. The drugs were hardly infallible, and eventually Justice Potter Stewart ruled that a confession induced by the administration of drugs is constitutionally inadmissible in a criminal trial. That doesn't stop frustrated courts from occasionally considering their use, most recently in the case of mass shooter James Holmes in Colorado. After Stewart ruled that a confession induced by the administration of drugs is constitutionally inadmissible in a criminal trial. That doesn't stop frustrated courts from occasionally considering their use, most recently in the case of mass shooter James Holmes in Colorado. After World War II ended, the world sighed with relief, but it was a short sigh, terminated by worldwide confrontation between East and West. It wasn't just about empire, land, and trade. The Cold War was also a fervent battle about doctrine and efforts to convert the enemy. Thus, coercive persuasion entered the next chapter. The Cold War started off with another show trial, this time involving Hungarian Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty. This slide shows a before and
Spit.
He was an ardent Hungarian nationalist who opposed any encroachment on the rights of the church. He was imprisoned, placed in solitary, starved so much that he lost 50% of his body weight, beaten and drugged. But what got to him most was the solitude. He wrote, "The quiet of solitary destroys the nerves. The monotony shatters the nervous system, wears the soul thin." He eventually confessed to a series of unlikely deeds like trying to steal the Hungarian crown jewels. The West assumed that the confessions were elicited through some special communist breakthrough in coercive persuasion. Meanwhile, half a world away, the biggest flashpoint of the Cold War took place in Korea. It was a vicious conflict fought in extreme conditions. The United States was unprepared for the war, sent troops to Korea in the dead of winter, dressed in summer tropical uniforms, and the front lurched repeatedly north and south. In the first year of the war, many American troops were captured. There were high death rates amongst the POWs. Many collaborated with the enemy by broadcasting anti-war messages. When the armistice was finalized, all prisoners were given a choice of where they wanted to be relocated. We crowed when thousands of Chinese and North Koreans repudiated going home and preferred to settle in the West. We were absolutely flummoxed when about 20 American POWs refused to come home, preferring instead to settle in China or Russia. How had this happened? What happened to them in the prison camps? A retired OSS propaganda agent, Edward Hunter, invented a new term for this behavior, brainwashing. He wrote, "In brainwashing, a fog settles over the patient's mind until he loses touch with reality. Brainwashing is something new, which is contrary to human nature and inseparable from communism." He didn't exactly invent the new word. Rather, he took a complex Chinese term, xinao, and repurposed it in a lurid term of brainwashing. U.S. military experts hated his terminology, found it flamboyant and misleading. Instead, they preferred coercive persuasion, a much more accurate term. But brainwashing to this day is the favored terminology in popular culture. If you do a Google search on brainwashing, you discover over 34 million web pages on this topic. Compare that to coercive persuasion with its 48,000 web pages. The Chinese treated prisoners with a mixture of brutality and kindness. There was an unusual methodical quality to their efforts. They subjected POWs to ceaseless propaganda, forced them to write long confessions, and placed them in groups where they denounced each other. Not only did they get POWs to confess to war crimes and make anti-war propaganda broadcasts, but the Chinese seemed to get better results over time. In the course of just a year and a half, the percent of POWs caving into pressure increased from 25% to 75%. POWs who started collaborating with the enemy were treated better, and at the time of the armistice, some declined to return home. America viewed this with consternation. On the one hand, there was fear that the Chinese had deployed some secret weapon invented by Pavlov. On the other hand, our troops were viewed as cowards for caving in. There was no understanding of what they had been through. This Herb Block cartoon captures the mood at home. Two executives sit in their private club discussing world events while drinking and smoking cigars. One says to the other that he would never have caved in. Instead, he would have said to the Reds, "Now see here." People lost sight of the fact that the POWs were treated with extraordinary brutality. Indeed, the POW death rates in Korea exceeded those found in Japan or Vietnam. Two critics of the Korean War were particularly harsh in their judgment of our soldiers, Major William Mayer and journalist Eugene Kincaid. To their mind, the GIs had no gumption, were victims of momism. The fault was that liberals had sapped our strength so much that there was no discipline. It was our fault that 38% of the prisoners callously allowed themselves to die. Other voices were not so sure about that judgment. They pointed to the prisoners' debility due to starvation and exposure to severe cold, their total dependency on their captors, and the constant dread of execution. In the light of the Korean War experience, President Eisenhower was advised to start a brain war offensive that would bring together the CIA and academic researchers. Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, felt that there was a contest with Russia to develop new techniques of brainwashing. The Russians take selected human beings whom they wish to destroy and turn them into humble confessors of crimes they never committed. New techniques wash the brain clean of the thoughts. Indirect CIA funding flowed to university researchers through foundations and research institutes. Harold Wolff and Larry Hinkle at Cornell received funds and channeled money through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. This MK Ultra funding supported scores of university laboratories across the country. Wolf at that time was America's leading neurologist, and Hinkle was a brilliant internist who studied stress and heart disease. Hinkle worked closely with the CIA on various projects that raised profound ethical considerations. Here we see how Wolf answered a delicate question posed by CIA agent White, who asks, what is the possibility of working out a graph indicating the state of panic of the enemy based upon the varying degree of pressure used? Wolf replied smoothly, yours is a very provocative notion, and I'm sure it could be documented. Warm regards. A shocking response from the tacit head of American neurology at the time. Wolf's proposal to CIA started out pretty ominously. Potentially useful secret drugs and various brain-damaging procedures will be tested in order to ascertain their fundamental effect upon brain function. As these drugs are investigated, a concurrent search for antidotes or countermeasures will be conducted. Then the proposal veered into an even more shocking direction. Where any of these studies involve potential harm to the subject, we expect the agency to make available suitable subjects and a proper place for the performance of necessary experiments.
He may have beat me the first two times, one or two times, but I've spanked his ass 4 or 5 times since then.
MK Ultra devoted enormous efforts at studying LSD, determining its dose, if there was habituation with continued use, if there was an antidote, or could it be used to immobilize an enemy. The studies frequently involved unwitting individuals surreptitiously dosed, and there were casualties. Perhaps the most notorious experiment involved Frank Olson, a government scientist who was surreptitiously dosed with LSD dropped into his Cointreau. In response, he became severely depressed and agitated. This family photo shows him as a father in happier times. The CIA took him to see Dr. Abramson, an LSD expert who had ties with the Institute. Rather than immediately hospitalize this VIP patient, Abramson sent him back to the Statler Hotel with 2 CIA minders. Olson died that night after falling out of his hotel window. It's not clear if it was an accident, if he jumped, or if he was pushed. The family was not told about the secret LSD dosing for decades. Perhaps some of you are familiar with Robert Ludlum's Jason Bourne books and movies. Recall the plot. A young soldier played by Matt Damon goes to see an avuncular psychiatrist who agrees to radically restructure the young man's life. The doctor destroys the man's memories and trains him to become a consummate assassin. It's a compelling story, and one that is partially based on one of the most notorious CIA-sponsored brainwashing studies. It's all true. Memory obliteration with LSD and electroconvulsive treatments, and memory restructuring during sleep. The assassin training was not part of the CIA endeavors in actuality. The work was done in Montreal. Psychiatrist Ewan Cameron headed up the Allen Institute of Psychiatry. Dr. Cameron believed that psychotherapy could be speeded up if you simply obliterated old memories and started anew. He repeatedly played tapes to patients about how they should think and feel. He obliterated memory with massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy as well as cocktails of LSD and other drugs. In weeks of this, he played tape loops up to 250,000 times while his patients slept. He succeeded in destroying memories, but could not show that his patients learned from tape repetitions. The lawsuits are still being adjudicated. From roughly 1915 to 1965, governments and universities tried to develop tools for brainwashing. They weren't exactly successful. Torture didn't persuade people to adopt different political beliefs, nor did it elicit information reliably. Any number of drugs could sedate, stimulate, or confuse people, but they weren't effective in interrogations or persuasion. Group pressure, sensory isolation, sleep deprivation were promising tools for coercive persuasion, but these required time and finesse. In the 1970s and 1980s, two unlikely players emerged demonstrating new techniques in dark persuasion: kidnappers and clerics. On August 23, 1973, Jan Erik Olsson robbed the Creditbanken Bank in Stockholm. He took the bank staff hostage and held them in the vault while negotiating with the police. Over the ensuing days, the hostages started collaborating with the captor, developed fondness for him, and began to distrust the police. He didn't torture, shoot, or rape the hostages. He was solicitous of them and caressed them. As one hostage put it, when he treated us well, we could think of him as God. When the police eventually liberated the hostages, they hugged the bank robber and shook hands in farewell, calling out, "I'll see you again." This wasn't just some Scandinavian liberal aberration. Similar events have been seen off and on all over the world, sometimes involving terrorists, sometimes kidnappings for money or sexual exploitation. These situations have become known as habas, or hostage and barricade situations. We have data on a dishearteningly large number of such situations. To a certain extent, the hostage is correct to distrust the police. In a kidnapping situation, he or she is more likely to be shot by the police than by the kidnappers. Ultimately, 50% of hostages form some kind of positive bond with their captor. The extent of the full-blown Stockholm Syndrome is unclear. Considerable work from all over the world has attempted to divine what kind of hostage situation or what kind of victim is more likely to be associated with these paradoxical fondnesses for the hostage taker. Stockholm-like phenomenon appear during longer-term captivity, and children appear to be singularly vulnerable. The Patricia Hearst kidnapping could be considered a variant of Stockholm, another bank robbery half a world away and half a year after the Stockholm robbery. Her autobiography describes very well her life prior to the kidnapping and since. I grew up in an atmosphere of clear blue skies, bright sunshine, rambling open spaces, long green lawns, country clubs with swimming pool, and I took it all for granted. I live now in a private protected street in a house equipped with the best electronic security system available. I do not live in fear, it's just that I feel older and wiser now. I am aware of the stark reality that I am vulnerable, that there are forces out there which are ever threatening. She had the misfortune to come to the attention of Donald DeFreeze. I'll let you read for yourselves his manifesto. DeFreeze was a violent criminal who nicknamed himself General Field Marshal Cinque Matumo, and he headed a small group called the Symbionese Liberation Army. Most of his rantings ended in death to the fascist insect who preys upon him. Miss Hearst was a Berkeley undergrad when she was violently abducted from her apartment. She was seized and hurled in the trunk of a car and then shoved in a closet while the SLA tried to extract a ransom. Her family agreed to distribute food to the poor, and there were riots as the food was being distributed. Within weeks of being abducted, Patricia changed her name to Tanya and joined the group as a revolutionary, ultimately robbing a bank with them. It's important to look at the compressed timeline of events. 10 weeks after kidnapping, she robs the Hibernia Bank. 3.5 months after the kidnapping, she engaged in a shootout at Mills Sporting Goods store. When she was eventually captured, she asserted that she had become a revolutionary. At trial, the defense claimed that she had been forced to do these things against her will. People wondered, how was she forced? Did it relate to her violent kidnapping and sensory isolation in the closet? The trial essentially focused on psychiatric expert witness testimony. On the defense side, psychologist Margaret Singer observed that her speaking and writing style had changed during her captivity, that her IQ had dropped due to extreme stress, and that she wasn't herself while being held by the SLA. Charlie West said that Hearst manifested chronic classic signs of coercive persuasion, that she was debilitated, had total dependency on her captors, and was living in constant dread. Martin Orne said that she was telling the truth as she saw it, that she had dissociated during her time with the SLA, or unconsciously split off those memories and actions. Robert Lifton recalled his experience with victims of Chinese thought reform and pointed out that she caved in under guilt, group pressure, and terror. The prosecution psychiatrists attacked this testimony. Joel Fort denied there was any such thing as brainwashing and stated that Hearst had merely converted her beliefs and joined the SLA robberies voluntarily for excitement. Harry Kozel described her as a frustrated, angry, confused girl who was ripe for the plucking, in a rebel in search of a cause. So the jury had to struggle with two questions. Was she guilty? That is, was it coercion or was it her own choice? Secondly, did they want to consider the circumstances of her kidnapping is a mitigating factor? The jury found her guilty, and the judge gave her no slack whatsoever. Her sentence was the typical first offense sentence for armed bank robbery. However, subsequently, she received presidential clemency and pardon. I've touched on how coercive persuasion evolved in the hands of government agencies, academia, and criminals. I'd like to finish by discussing how religious cults have used coercive persuasion. Heaven's Gate began in Houston and was led by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who renamed themselves Bo or Doe and T or D. They were convinced that they literally belonged with the stars and that they were trapped on Earth in bodies that were actually archaic vessels from space. They started wandering and proselytizing about UFOs and redemption. They formed a group called Heaven's Gate and preached a life of asceticism. Get your vehicle under control was their motto. They preached eating pure food and avoiding sexuality, which they felt corroded their vessels. Some even had themselves castrated to stop sexual temptation. They emphasized conformity and renamed themselves with peculiar names. They discouraged contacts with family and friends. They had very precise rules to help them find their way in the world. Major offenses were things like deceit or sensuality. Lesser offenses including having private thoughts or being curious. Over the years, the membership dwindled and the feel of the group darkened. And by that time, they were living in a mansion here in Rancho Santa Fe. We might never have heard of them, and they might never have killed themselves, except for the bad luck of the Hale-Bopp comet. In 1996 and 1997, this was the brightest and longest-lasting comet in known history. It came upon us as a surprise, and Bo was convinced that trailing the comet was a spaceship coming to take them home to the stars. He persuaded the group that if they killed themselves during the comet's closest pass to Earth, they would teleport finally to the stars and immortality. The group vowed to kill themselves, but videotaped farewells in advance. Sitting tranquilly in the grounds of their mansion, they talked about their joy in anticipating the next step. Some tried to head off criticism, anticipating that the press would paint them as disturbed. In their words, "This is my family. Laying down this vehicle is going to be great. I'm shedding it like a husk." Others stared into the camera and said, "I'm the happiest person on the world to be doing this," or "I have such joy and wonder at the thought of going home." Over the course of one day, they killed themselves in 3 waves. All were dressed identically. They ingested vodka, mixed barbiturates into their pudding, and put plastic bags over their heads. Then they were all gone. When the bodies were discovered and autopsied, pathologists were astonished to find that many of the men had been castrated. I've focused on brainwashing in the 20th century. While it was tempting to talk about current events and controversies, I think we need more distance in time to have a dispassionate perspective. However, I do have some thoughts on things that might develop in the future. The first challenge will be neuroscience. We were able to do some surprising things in the 1960s. Robert Heath pioneered in deep brain stimulation, studying how implanted electrodes could modify complex behavior in people. The CIA asked that he work with them on pleasure and pain circuits, but he spurned them, saying, "I'm a doctor, not a spy." We can do much more today with safer and more precise surgery. We are restrained by a sense of professional ethics by focusing on clinical conditions. Would that restraint be evident in times of war? I think the bigger challenge will come from social media. Social media offers so much promise, but there is a dark side. We need to ask ourselves if social media can be weaponized as a tool for coercive persuasion. If social media is associated with bullying, coercion, surreptitious monitoring, and restricted information, one has to wonder if it is a tool for coercive persuasion. In this sense, social media is just another social intoxicant.
Man, I'm
as
spanking
we know
his
so
ass.
well from the example of drinking and driving, it
I'm just a
takes
better
many
chess player than
decades
he is.
for cultures to develop expectations for how one interacts with new
I'm just a little bit smarter than his ass is. Now you're gonna lose one of
George
those rooks
Orwell
too.
Soberly observed,
And they ain't a
if you want
damn
a
thing you can do
picture
about it.
of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. From my point of view, if we ignore the potential of brainwashing and the developments in the 21st century, then we are defenseless, and Orwell will have been right. But I do believe we have a choice. We need to look back and consider how brainwashing developed in the 20th century, prepare ourselves for the new century. We need to listen to H.G. Wells, who warned that human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. We are in such a race now. It is up to us to define the emerging contours of dark persuasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was a fascinating and very timely talk. If I may, I thought I would get us started with something I've been wondering about. You know, your book contains so many examples of the challenging role that psychiatry has played in exploring or aiding coercive persuasion, brainwashing, I guess I'll say. It's easier for me to say. How do you see the field of psychiatry responding to those ethical dilemmas today?
Well, it wasn't just psychiatry. It was psychology, it was neurology, neurosurgery. This was a vast academic endeavor in the social, behavioral sciences and in all of the health sciences. And I think it continues to be that way. I don't think psychiatry is singularly vulnerable to the allure of brainwashing. It just happened that psychiatrists and psychologists have been involved in this very actively from the beginning.
You know, I'm reflecting on the changes just in medical research in general that led to institutional review boards. And I think the training we all get says we learned from those past mistakes, and now we've reached a new era, right, where we engage in more ethical research. And so this is maybe a rhetorical question, but it's interesting to think about the studies that students and how that might influence the notion of ethical research.
I think that the ethical restraints are going to be terribly important, so that we don't recapitulate this. In times of travail, in times of war, it's natural to look for things, but one also has to ask questions about what is the ethics of investigation. The sorts of things that happened under MK Ultra studies were just inexcusable. In the LSD studies, many people were surreptitiously dosed and became psychiatric casualties who had no idea what had happened to them. They'd be at a bar, someone would drop something in a drink. These things happened in the 50s and 60s.
I will say that your chapter describing the work of McGill was eye-opening for me. That was a new area.
Well, it is interesting. People just don't remember this, and it's not that long ago. And I think it's for this reason that it's important to look back in history. I must say that, referring back to some of my comments about research libraries and archives, studying this was a challenge and a pleasure because of the excitement of the hunt for archival data. Much of the data about the things that went on in Montreal, oddly enough, are hidden in the archives at UCLA, of all places. It had nothing to do with UCLA. Similarly, the stuff that went on in Montreal always accessible in New York Hospital at Cornell. And of course, there's some logic for why it would be there. But going into the archives, I would encourage people to do this. If you've got a research question, it's a matter of sleuthing, and it's fascinating to look at these information.
And I think you just expertly answered the question that Phyllis asked to have you tell us a little bit more about your research. We have gotten a couple questions asking about the Manchurian Candidate, the novel and movie, and so somebody asked, could that sort of brainwashing depicted in that movie actually result in the intended aim? So I don't know if you know the work, but if you do, I would welcome your reflection.
It's a wonderful movie, just a great tale. I find little evidence to suggest that that is possible. Not for, and the CIA certainly looked hard for that.
And we've had a few folks asking, wanting to explore a little bit more about the role of social media in persuasion. And so somebody asks, could a numerically high number or volume of messages, with certain messaging, aggressive support, have an impact on an individual similar to what might happen in the Stockholm Syndrome, those examples you gave?
So I think that's the question. And it's a question that, oddly enough, in our polarized times, there are few things that Republicans and Democrats agree on, but the concern about social media is one of them. Any thoughtful person is concerned about this. People are persuaded by social media. That's the whole point. So the question is, under what circumstances can social media be coercive? And that's the question for all of us as citizens to ask ourselves. Is there something surreptitious going on in social media? Are algorithms going on behind the screen that we're unaware of? Is bullying going on social media? Is there something addictive about social media? In other words, asking all the questions that one asks about any other circumstance of alleged coercive persuasion, that's fair game for social media. The solution is a challenging one, particularly in a democracy. But on some level, social media already is regulated and probably needs more regulation. How that will come about in the future remains to be determined.
Your response makes me think of the work that studies bias in data and algorithms, and just how a small piece of bias coded into a software program has really negative outcomes. And your response is making me think of Twitter bots and other activities, where there's so much automations going into news generation or news filtering that we lose control, or we actually lose the ability to see outside the boundaries. So that as an individual, you can't see the world beyond kind of the landscape the social media landscape's created. I'm curious if this is a new phenomenon for you, or if it's very similar to the studies in the past where the world of an individual under a high level of influence has been so contained that they become, that perception becomes their entire world.
Well, coercive persuasion becomes all the more powerful in restricted environments. When you are isolated from former friends and family, when you are selectively exposed to only certain sorts of information, it becomes harder to struggle against coercive persuasion in those senses. Going back to Pavlov, Pavlov loved his dogs, and Pavlov demonstrated that dogs learn. We all know that. But Pavlov also made a comment, a very shrewd one, that we sometimes overlook, and that is that dogs learn best when they are in a restricted environment, when they're not distracted. So the best way of training a dog, persuading, is in a quiet, restricted environment. So I guess I'd say that to the extent that the algorithms behind social media result in ever more restricted access to information, skewing information, we are in jeopardy.
Thank you so much, Joel, for your time tonight. Just want to express appreciation, and actually I'll read a quick comment from Douglas, who says, no question, just applause. The interest in effort in this research is clear. We can infer so much from Professor Dimsdale's teaching just from his talk. And Douglas goes on to say, I'm here because of his service to the entire campus, well outside his own field and beyond medicine or health sciences. So with that, join us all, or hope all of our audience joins us in virtual applause for Joel. So with that, thank you so much all, and have a good evening.
Be a dumbass from that damn poem down here. I'm gonna fuck your butt. Yep. Stupid! Spit, 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 spit. I fucked his hole! Man, I'm beating the fuck out of this guy. He spit. I guess I beat his ass enough. I guess he doesn't want anymore. Nope. I beat his ass enough tonight. Let's see how many times I beat this. Let's see how many times I beat his ass. Scroll down, you bitch. Fucking bitch. The first game we played, he beat my ass by checkmate. The second game we played, I beat his ass. The second game we played, I beat his ass. The third game we played, I beat his ass. The fourth game we played, I beat his ass. The fifth game we played, he beat me. So that's 2 for 4. I beat his ass. I beat his ass. I lost count. I think he beat me 2 times. I think I beat his ass 5 or 6 times. I fucked his hole. I was just a little bit smarter than he was. Cute kitten. I just beat his fucking ass. Let's challenge them again. I feel like beating up somebody. My two fists feel like they need some exercise. Beating up somebody. Well, I guess his ass is too sore from that ass fucking I gave him. No. Oozy spit. Oozy spit. Come on, I want a nice shot of her arm. She's got a nice spit arm. With her red spit. Man, she's got a nice arm. I hope mine are longer than hers. I hope my forearm's longer than her spit smells. I don't need that one anymore. Not after I've seen her long spit smell. With her snot spit. Man, she's got some spit smell arms. Oozy spit. Is this the same girl? Let's see if I get a screenshot of her snot arms. This is fucking pissed me off. Yeah. There she goes. I can get a snot arm right here. Now I can see mine is longer than hers. I sure hope it is. With spit? Man, look at her spit smell arms. With spit smell. No. Wilkins' clothes are out. With Uzi, Emily. Well, enough of this